Hello, and welcome back to Into the Verse. Over the next few episodes, we'll be diving deep into types. Types are a concept in programming that allow us to give functionality to objects we create. You might have heard of the terms strictly typed language or loosely typed language. In the case of verse, it is a strictly typed language. What does that mean? That means that every object we create, every variable, no matter what it is, it has a type assigned to it, and that type can never change. Once an object is created, it is whatever it is for all and until the object goes away. And today we're going to be covering some of the common types. Verse separates their types into three fields: common, composite, and container types. And today we're going to be looking at the common types. At least we're going to be looking at the common types. So let's start with the easiest one to understand: an integer. So I'm going to go ahead and in verse here, I'm going to make an object real quick called myInt. And I'm going to set it. I'm going to set the type using the colon as int, short for integer, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. So what is an integer? I'm sure most of you are aware of what an integer is, but an integer is any whole number. And so that can be positive or negative. So it could be 0, it could be 1, it could be negative 56, it could be 15,869. But what it cannot be is 5.2. Why can it not be 5.2? Well, like I said earlier, an integer is any whole number. And 5.2 is not a whole number, right? This decimal means that it is not a whole number. So we remove it, 5 is fine. Okay, that's pretty simple on integers. There's a lower bounds and an upper bounds of how big and small an integer can be. I don't know them off the top of my head, but if you are curious, you can look that information up. The next type we're going to be taking a look at is the float, right? So my float is of type float, okay? And a float is any floating point value. So that's like an integer, but it has a decimal, right? So 1.2 is a float. Negative 6.7 is a float. 11,000 is not a float, right? It's just an integer. So if we put 0.0 though, it is a float. So a floating point value is what this float stands for, and it means that this decimal point can move. So we can tack on as many extra digits to the end of this, and this floating point will sit here and it kind of float. So that's why that is called a float. Okay, the next type that we're going to be looking at is the logic. Okay, logic. So I'm going to make an object, my logic. It's going to be of type logic. And a logic is like a Boolean. If you've come from other languages or you know what a Boolean is, it is a true or false conditional object, right? So a true or false object, it can either be true, it can be false, it can be nothing else. This is useful when writing code that might diverge, right? You might go down one path if something is true, or if that thing is not true, we might go down another path and do some different operations. That is the logic. Okay, the next one I'm sure you've probably heard of is a string. So I'm going to write out my string. So it's of type string. And a string is a string of characters, right? So between two quotations, I can write as many characters as I want. Hi, I'm programming. This is a string of characters. So we have, capital H, we have lowercase letters, we have spaces, we have punctuation marks, exclamation mark, So all these characters can go into a string and it makes up a string. And that's kind of the most common types you're going to be using. Those are the most common types you will be using in verse. Ints, floats, logics, and strings. However, there are a couple other common types that we can touch on without going too deep into them, as you'll probably not see them as commonly or use them in a manner that we were creating objects here. So let's take a character, for example, or char, as a lot of people call it. So I'm going to make a new object real quick I call it my char, C-H-A-R, kind of like Charmander. And it is of type char. And what I'm going to set this equal to is, instead of using quotations, I'm going to use the single apostrophe on either side to denote that a single character goes going in here. And then this character can be anything I want. So A. This is a single character, right? A char. Now, this can be a capital. It can be a digit, I believe. Yep. I think it can be, yeah, it could be used exclamation mark. Any kind of, anything that could go in a string can go inside of a char, except it's a single character. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason that all characters that can go into a string can go into a char. And the reason is, a string, when you drill down into it, if I hover over here, you can see it's an array of char. Now, I don't believe we've covered arrays just yet, but just know they're like lists of things, right? So you can have a lot of things in an array, and it culminates into one array. In this case, right, we have a lot of different chars, a lot of different characters, and they all culminate into one single string. And I could even iterate through this string, so don't worry if you don't totally understand what I'm doing right now. I'm going to write a for loop, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the character, each character from our string, my string, and I'm going to print them. Actually, I cannot print because I believe print requires a string and not a char. But I could potentially do something with my character, right? So character here, if I'm looping through a string, which again is an array of chars, I will be able to extract each letter or each character individually. And you might want to do some work with that later, you know, for string comparisons or whatnot. There's a couple different ways to use that. For the most part, you probably won't be using char in isolation. There's also char32, which is a specific type of ASCII code. I believe it is referring to the code for New Line. I could be wrong in that. Somebody can correct me if char32 is something that can even be used in verse. I've never found any use for that type. That type, by the way, looks like this. And then a couple other types that you probably will never be using in this context, at least. One of them is any. So this is my any. I know it sounds like a strange name for an object, but it is of type any. And in this case, I don't think I can equal it to, yeah, I can. So any is the super type of all of these types. In fact, all types in verse. So any can be kind of anything. And we can cast an anything to a thing. So in this case, where any is equal to 0, I could go and make a new object and say it's going to be an integer, and I could try to cast my any to that integer, and it should work. However, if any was a character like this, and I tried to cast it to an integer, it would no longer work, right? Because this is a character, and my integer only accepts integers. Again, any is not a super useful keyword type right now. In the future, I believe it'll be better as we're going to get more access to parametric programming, but that is for another video. And I think the last type I wanted to touch on, there are a couple more, but void. So I'm going to make a object called myVoid, and I don't think this is going to work. It does work, and I'm a little surprised this works, but a void it means nothing, essentially, right? You can see we have a void right here in our onBegin function, and that's because our onBegin is returning nothing, and we'll cover what returning means in a future video. But void just means nothing. You would never write it in this context. I don't believe there's a single reason that you would ever make an object that was a type of void. Void is usually only used to denote that a function is not returning anything. But those are the common types in verse. And that's going to do it for this episode. I know it was kind of a short one, but in the next couple episodes, we'll be looking at the other two concept of types in verse, one being composite and the other one being container types. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time on Into the Verse.